Hi, and welcome back to part two of British imperialism in India. In part one, we established what imperialism is. We talked about how the British were taking territory really all over the globe, and we looked at the positive and negative effects of British imperialism in India. There's definitely some good things that came out of it, but I think the negative, outweigh the good. In part two, we're going to focus on the reaction of the Indian people. The reaction comes in the form of something called the Sepoy Mutiny. If you recall, in part one, we talked about how Sepoys were Indian soldiers who were part of the British Army. And you can see they typically wore these red uniforms, red being very synonymous with the British Empire. The Sepoy Mutiny is a strong reaction to British rule, but for very different reasons. And what we're going to see here is you would think a mutiny, which is people who rise up against their leaders. You'd typically think a mutiny like this would be successful in establishing Indian control back in India, but it's actually going to have quite the opposite effect. It's only going to strengthen British control in India. So let's talk about what the Sepoy Mutiny was all about. By 1850, the British had controlled most of the Indian subcontinent, but there were pockets of discontent. You have to understand, just because one group controls another group doesn't mean that the subjugated group is happy about it. And we've seen that countless times in history. So there's definitely people in India who are not happy about British rule. Part of the reason they weren't happy is for all the obvious reasons. The British were taking their economy, taking their money. British were controlling everything politically. But also many Indians believed the British were trying to convert them to Christianity. After all, the British had brought missionaries. This is part of when we talked about the Age of Exploration, how we talked about God, glory, and gold, right? The Europeans wanted to convert people to Christianity. Well, at the time, many of the Indians were either Hindu or Muslim, and they're going to have some resentment over the British bringing in Christianity and trying to convert them. Many Indians resented the constant racism the British expressed towards them. There are a lot of British soldiers in charge that did not treat the Indians very kindly, as you can see from this image up here. So there's definitely going to be a lot of anger and hostility towards the British. The British were not very peaceful people. Doesn't mean they slaughtered Indians, but they weren't very kind to them. So the Sepoy Mutiny starts when in 1857 a rumor spreads that Sepoy rifle cartridges were greased with beef and pork fat. Now, you would grease them, obviously, so that they could reload and that the guns wouldn't jam. I mean, you needed that lubricant there. But look at what's going on here. Greased with beef and pork fat. Well, you have two main groups of people in India, right? You have the Hindus and you have the Muslims. Well, cows are sacred to Hindus, so they're not going to use anything that's greased with beef fat. Muslims don't eat pork, and they're not going to use anything that's greased with pig fat. So this is a huge insult to both of these two groups of people. When they find out about this, they're livid, because in a way it essentially goes against their religion, and they're definitely going to be upset. So 85 of the 90 sepoys who heard about this rumor refused the cartridges and were ultimately jailed by the British. Well, you can imagine that's not going to go over so well. On the next day, May 10th, 1857, they rebelled. So what you're going to see here is a Sepoy mutiny is going to grow in northern India, because these sepoys marched to Delhi and captured the city there, and the rebellion spread to northern and central India. Take a look at this on a map on the next slide. Fierce fighting took place. Each side really tried to slaughter the other side's army. The British trying to take out the sepoys who were once part of them. They're Indian men, but they're fighting for the British army, and they're trying to break away. Of course, the sepoys are trying to fight the British, so you got a lot of fighting that's going on both sides. Here you see an image, sepoys on this side fighting the British army. You're going to have Indians on both sides, of course. Here's the map I was mentioning. You can see Delhi here. Everything in this orange area is area of the Sepoy revolt. Everything else, of course, is controlled by the British, but this is where the Sepoys are really trying to take over. Again, mutiny is a word that is used to describe when one group tries to take over another. When we watched Amistad, it was a mutiny aboard the Amistad when Sinkay and those Africans took over the ship. It's also called an insurrection when one group rises up to try to take out their authority. Now, this is where things go badly for the Sepoys because the Indian government was too weak to intervene. Remember, the Indian government is strongly influenced by the British. In fact, the British really control the Indian government. So the Indian government is not strong enough to intervene and help improve this rebellion. So it takes about a year, but as things start to settle down, the British actually emerged from this with more control. The British took control and ruled from this point in the 1850s all the way up until 1947. So this ends poorly for the Indians because it only tightens British control. The part of India under British rule was now called the Raj, meaning rule or sovereignty. So you might hear that word when you hear British control. Of course, when this is all said and done, the Sepoy Mutiny fueled the racist attitudes of the British and increased distrust between Indians and the British. Naturally, you know, the Sepoys rose up and their mutiny failed to take back the country. They were upset with the insult of the, you know, pig and beef fat. But in the end, what this is basically going to do is solidify British control, and it's going to increase racism. The British won't like the Indians won't like the British more so than in the past. And that distrust is going to be very, very difficult to live with. Of course, we're not talking about this Raj when we talk about the Raj for you Big Bang fans out there. And then this ultimately leads to nationalism. So in the early 1800s, some Indians began demanding more modernization and a greater role in governing themselves. Naturally, they're not going to get it because the British are going to tighten their control. And when we talk about nationalism, nationalism is extreme pride in one's culture or country. I mean, we, you know, are very patriotic here in the United States. We believe very strongly in democracy. That's nationalism. We believe our way of governing and our country is the best. And you have to take the role of a lot of different countries in the world. Many of them feel that way about themselves as well. So even though the British have control in India, the Indians still feel like they're Indian. They don't want to be controlled by the British. They don't want British culture. And that matters. Because as this nationalism continues to grow, you know, that's going to help fuel an independence movement later on. So this guy here, who you see here, whose name is Ram Mohan Roy, who's sometimes called the father of modern India, he started questioning the systems in India that existed. He believed that arranged child marriages and that rigid caste system that I talked about at the end of part one needed to change, or India would continue to be controlled by outsiders. Basically, he says, hey, our system is broken. This is what's allowing the British to come in and rule, so we need to modernize, we need to change ourselves in order to take back India for the Indian people. And I think he was absolutely right. So Indians began to have nationalist feelings and resented a system that made them second-class citizens in their own country. I mean, they started to look at the British and going, hey, you might have control, but maybe we want to do something about it. And it's going to take quite a few decades to get there. They're going to need somebody to organize them. They're going to need somebody to show them how to fight back against the British. But as of right now, at least they're starting to feel very strongly in who they are and ultimately what they want from their country. And it's going to be Gandhi's story, and that's a good place for us to end here, because when we talk about how British imperialism ultimately leads to independence, that's the name of our unit after all, we're definitely going to have to focus on Gandhi's story, but we're not there yet. So our result of this part of the story is that history has shown that when mistreated long enough, humans will eventually react in an attempt to improve their situation. The seeds of change had been set in India, which later led to an independence movement led by Mahatma Gandhi. Okay, so we've established that the British are in control, talked about the Sepoy Mutiny and its failure to take India back, and now we have this nationalism that's growing within the Indian people to the point where they're willing to listen to a guy like Gandhi who believed in peaceful protests to try to take their country back from the British. That's how we're actually going to end this unit, is by looking at Gandhi's story. As of right now, we've seen that the British are in control of India. There's been some positive and negative changes that came out of this. Certainly a negative change would be the Sepoy Mutiny itself. but the nationalist feelings are growing.
All right, let's wrap up today's lecture by looking at our constructive response questions one more time. First question says, categorize the positive and negative effects of British imperialism. There's no doubt we have plenty of information on this. Certainly the negative effects of British imperialism in India is the Indians lost their culture, they lost their autonomy, it hurt agriculture, it hurt their industry. Certainly they lost the ability to govern themselves. We've got lots of good examples that we can use there. On the positive side, the British built dams, the British built railroads, they built schools and brought medicine. And there's a lot of great things that came along with the British because the British were a pretty advanced country for their time. So they're going to bring those things with them wherever they go, and other people can benefit from them. So we've got lots that we can use on the positive and negative side of British imperialism. The Sepoy Mutiny, we first should talk about the Sepoys were Indians who were fighting for the British, and eventually they found out that their rifle cartridges were greased with pork and beef fat, and they rebelled, and they took over Delhi, and it looked like they were going to fight the British and kick them out, but the Indian government was too weak to really intervene and strengthen this rebellion. So ultimately what this mutiny did was allow for stronger British control in the end. In essence, it was a failure because the British just tightened their control over India. But it shows you how imperialism can affect the culture and ultimately the willingness for a group of people to be ruled. They were obviously upset with the British being there and treating them and their culture poorly with those rifle cartridges. So that's going to do it for us here today on British imperialism in India. Hope you learned something. We'll see you next time.